Disclaimer. The following story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment. All characters, names, and events are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, organizations, or situations is purely coincidental. This story is intended to entertain and inspire, not to represent any actual events or individuals. Please enjoy it as a creative work of fiction. The first letter showed up on a Tuesday, folded into a bright orange envelope that looked like a parking ticket and felt just as cheerful. Notice of non-compliance, it read. You have 48 hours to remove or demolish the unapproved structure located on HOA property, or legal action will follow. They meant my cabin. Technically, it wasn't even a cabin. It was a one-room shack on the edge of the lake, a glorified shed I'd restored from rotted timber and stubbornness. I'd spent the last 6 months sanding, patching, and rewiring it so I could have a place to fish, read, and breathe air that didn't smell like copy or ink. I built it on land I thought was mine. Emphasis on thought. When I bought my house 3 years ago, the property map looked clear enough, a long, narrow strip that sloped down toward the water. What the fine print actually meant was that the last 10 feet near the shoreline were community easement. Translation, HOA turf. So now, apparently, my little cabin was a non-compliant lakeside structure. I called the HOA president, a man named Doug Pendergrass, whose voice always sounded like it was filtered through a spreadsheet. Doug, I said, you've been down to the lake. You've seen the cabin. It's not hurting anything. Doug cleared his throat. Regulations are regulations, Mr. Hale. No unapproved outbuildings, especially on common property. If it were up to me, I'd let it slide, but it is up to you, I said. Well, he said, technically the board decides. The board was just Doug and 2 neighbors who owed him favors. By Thursday morning, I had another notice taped to my door, this one stamped final warning. Someone had underlined demolish 3 times in red. Now I could have folded, hauled out the sledgehammer, mourned my cabin, and gone back to my cubicle life. But every nail in that shack was a Saturday I'd earned. And there was something about Doug's smug legalese that made my coffee taste bitter. That night, I stayed up late reading property law. By sunrise, I'd found something interesting. The HOA didn't technically own the land under the community easement. The subdivision's developer had transferred the rights to a holding company 20 years ago. The HOA only leased it from me, because that holding company was one of those tax shelters that went belly up after the 2008 crash. A few years ago, I'd quietly bought its assets at auction for almost nothing, mainly to secure an old dock permit. I never thought about it again. Until now. I dug through a stack of folders, found the deed, and laughed so hard I scared my dog. The HOA had given me 48 hours to demolish a structure that sat on their rented land. And the lease renewal? It was due Friday. Have you ever dealt with a Homeowners Association? You know the folks who measure your lawn with a ruler and send you angry letters about the color of your mailbox? Well, my HOA, run by a guy named Doug, decided my little lakeside cabin, a place that had been in my family for generations, had to go. They called it an unauthorized structure and sent me demolition notices. They thought they had me cornered. They were wrong. This wasn't just about a cabin, it was about principle. So I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with bureaucratic nonsense. I dove into decades of dusty paperwork, county records, and obscure legal documents. And buried deep in the HOA's own charter, I found it. The ultimate reverse card. A little detail they had completely overlooked. The land their precious clubhouse and our entire community shoreline sat on wasn't actually theirs. It belonged to a dormant holding company. A company I legally revived, making me, technically, their landlord. The best part? Their lease was set to expire. At noon. On Friday. Friday morning arrived, and I was ready. I walked into the HOA office, a converted pool house that perpetually smelled of weak coffee and quiet desperation. Doug, the HOA president, sat behind a desk big enough to land a helicopter on. He looked at me over his glasses with a smug little frown. Mr. Hale, he said, pushing a form across the desk. Here to sign the demolition compliance form? I couldn't help but smile. I placed my own folder on his desk. Actually, Doug, I said, I'm here about your lease renewal. Doug just blinked at me. Lease? He repeated, confused. Yup, I said. The one that lets you use this shoreline parcel. You know, the same one my little cabin just happens to sit on. He let out this little cough-like laugh. That's HOA property, Mr. Hale. I slid the new deed across his giant desk. Not afternoon today, I said cheerfully. Technically, you've been renting this land from me. The silence in that room was spectacular. One of the board members froze with her coffee straw halfway to her mouth. Doug picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it once, then twice. His face went through about 5 different stages of disbelief. This can't be right, he stammered. Oh, it's all filed and legal, I assured him. County clerk's stamp, taxes paid, the whole 9 yards. You could hear a sprinkler hissing outside, like a tiny drum roll building the tension. Finally, Doug cleared his throat. Well, he said, the fight draining from his voice, I suppose we can discuss terms. I'm glad you said that, I replied, because I've got an idea that helps us both. He was expecting me to demand a fortune, or maybe just kick them out. Revenge would have been sweet, but I had something much, much smarter in mind. The cabin stays, I stated simply, but it becomes a community resource. A lakeside reading room, a fishing shack, an art studio for residents. I'll maintain it and you get to list it as a brand new community amenity. Doug frowned, his mind already spinning. Amenities require budget allocations, he started. Exactly, I cut in, which means increased property appeal, which leads to higher home values for everyone. You get to take credit for improving the lakefront, and I get to keep my cabin. It's a win-win. He absolutely hated it. You could see the gears turning in his head. He hated that I had won, but he loved the sound of higher property values even more. He leaned back in his chair, calculating. And the new lease rate? He asked, trying to regain some control. I tapped the paperwork and gave him my biggest grin. Well, since you're technically late renewing, market rates have gone up. We'll say triple the old rate. But don't worry, that includes all the maintenance, insurance, and upgrades to make the cabin a public use space. Doug's jaw just worked silently for a moment, then a long, defeated sigh. You're impossible, he muttered. Persistent, I corrected him. Also punctual. And you've got about 30 minutes before that old rate expires for good. He stared at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, and he cracked a smile. A real one. You realize, he said, if this works, people will never stop talking about it. That's kind of the point, isn't it? He picked up his pen. Fine. But the cabin gets a fresh coat of paint. Deal, I said. By sunset, the board had voted. The cabin was officially an Azure Shore community amenity. I hung a little wooden sign by the door. Cabin Commons, open to all, including me. The transformation was immediate. Over the weekend, I added a couple of chairs, a bookshelf people quickly filled with donated books, and a coffee pot. Kids started showing up with their fishing poles. Retirees brought sketchbooks and painted the sunset. Someone even left a little potted fern on the windowsill. By Monday, the HOA newsletter, the same one that used to threaten me, proudly announced the new lakefront cabin opens for community use, thanks to cooperative partnership with resident. I couldn't have written a better headline myself. Later that week, I saw Doug inspecting the fresh paint job. He turned to me, and to my surprise said, You know, the members actually like it. They think it gives the lake character. Glad to hear it, I replied. And just so you know, the next lease review is in 1 year. Plenty of time to build even more character. He gave me a look that was half glare, half grin. You're dangerous with paperwork, he said. I just smiled, only when provoked. Within a month, the cabin had a waiting list. The HOA, now advertising exclusive lake access with a rustic community cabin, saw property values begin to climb. At meetings, Doug started introducing me as our resident facilities liaison. It sounded official enough. I didn't get revenge. I got something better. I got peace, a permanent lakeside office, and a better coffee machine than the one in the HOA office. But the real victory came at the next big community meeting. Doug himself raised his hand and asked, completely serious, "We might consider expanding the program. Mr. Hale, do you have any suggestions?" I leaned forward with a smile. "Actually, yes. There's an old boathouse near the South Dock that could really use some love." And just like that, my accidental real estate empire began to grow. So, if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare, remember, sometimes the best solution isn't fighting back, but rewriting the rules of the game entirely. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. By the time summer rolled in, Cabin Commons had become the most popular spot in the neighborhood. What started as my humble lakeside shack now looked like a cross between a Pinterest board and a national park brochure. Someone had added string lights along the roof. The kids built a birdhouse out of popsicle sticks. Even the HOA newsletter called it a charming symbol of community cooperation. I had to admit, it felt good. One Saturday morning, Doug showed up at the cabin wearing sunglasses, boat shoes, and the expression of a man trying to appear relaxed. He carried a clipboard, which gave him away immediately. "Hale," he said, "we've had several positive comments about the cabin." "I've noticed," I said, handing him a cup of coffee from the community pot. "So," he said, squinting at the lake, "we were thinking maybe it's time to expand the program." I tried not to laugh. "Expand?" "Yes. The South Dock's been falling apart for years. If we could turn the old boathouse into a similar amenity, we'd increase property appeal even further." Translation: he wanted to copy my idea. "Doug," I said, "that boathouse is practically sinking. It's a money pit." He shrugged. "The board's considering investing in repairs." "And the land lease?" I asked casually. He hesitated. "Same deal as before, I assume?" "Not exactly," I said. "See, the boathouse parcel is technically part of the same old holding company property, meaning it's under my management too." His eyebrows twitched. "You bought that one too?" "I told you I like paperwork," I said. The next week, I found myself somehow appointed community development consultant. I didn't argue. The title came with free coffee at the clubhouse. Doug and I walked the South Dock together, clipboard between us like a peace treaty. The boathouse leaned to one side, its paint peeling in shades of surrender. "This could be something great," I said. "Kayak rentals, maybe a small workshop space. We could run it as a self-sustaining venture." Doug scribbled notes, trying to keep up. "How self-sustaining are we talking?" "Well," I said, "if you include lease fees and upkeep, we might need to adjust rates slightly." He groaned. "Triple again?" "Doug," I said with a smile, "you can't put a price on community spirit." He muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "Apparently, you can." Over the next month, I watched the boathouse transform. Volunteers patched the roof, teens painted murals, retirees fixed the dock. The HOA supplied tools and materials. I supplied enthusiasm and a steady stream of lemonade. We opened in July with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a banner that read, "South Dock Commons, a partnership of progress." Doug insisted on cutting the ribbon himself. The local paper showed up for photos. The caption the next day read, "HOA celebrates lakeside renewal. Resident collaboration leads the way." Doug looked like he'd bitten into a lemon in the photo, but I was grinning so wide it could have been an ad for toothpaste. Of course, success breeds ambition. 2 weeks later, Doug called me in for another chat. "Listen," he said, flipping through a binder the thickness of a dictionary. "The board wants to discuss your management of the easement properties. Some members think we should formalize the arrangement." "Formalize how?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "Perhaps a subcommittee. Shared oversight. Accountability." Ah, there it was, the power itch. The HOA couldn't stand that something in their jurisdiction wasn't entirely under their thumb. I grinned. "Sure," I said. "Let's do it. But if we're sharing oversight, that means shared liability too." Doug froze. "Liability?" "Yeah," I said. "Technically, I'm the lessor, you're the operator. If we co-manage, any property incidents, injuries, damages would legally fall under joint responsibility." He blinked twice, then leaned back. "Maybe we'll just keep the current structure." Wise choice, I said. By late summer, the lakefront buzzed with life. Families kayaked at sunset, kids fished off the dock, and my once illegal cabin was now featured on the HOA's brochure. I'd become something of a local legend, not for breaking rules, but for bending them so gracefully they looked like policy. Neighbors started coming to me with problems: fence disputes, zoning quirks, parking issues. Apparently, I'd become the unofficial HOA whisperer. Even Doug mellowed out. One evening, he stopped by the cabin and dropped a folder on the table. "What's this?" I asked. "Renewal forms," he said. "Figured I'd get them in early this time." I flipped through. Everything was in order. Then I spotted a note at the bottom. "Lease rate adjusted, per mutual agreement." "Doug," I said, "you just voluntarily tripled your own rent again." He sighed. "It's easier than arguing with you." I laughed. Progress. By the end of the year, what started as an HOA ultimatum had turned into a partnership that made our community the envy of every neighborhood within 50 miles. Property values had jumped. The HOA was suddenly pro-innovation, and I got a seat at every planning meeting, with voting rights. Sometimes when I sit by the lake at night, lights from the cabin reflecting on the water, I think back to that first angry orange envelope. If they'd never given me 48 hours to demolish my cabin, none of this would exist. Funny how bureaucracy can build more than it breaks, if you just learn how to read the fine print. By the next spring, the story of the guy who outpapered the HOA had spread farther than I expected. One day I got an email from a neighboring community. "We heard what you did with the lake project. Our HOA's a mess. Any chance you consult?" Consult. I liked the sound of that. A few meetings later, I was sitting in another boardroom with another group of clipboard warriors, explaining how community spaces could generate revenue if residents felt ownership. It worked again, then another, and another. Before long, I wasn't just fixing HOA disputes, I was helping them run better. And every single one? I leased their easement properties through my revived company, legally, transparently, and yes, profitably. Doug stopped by my cabin one evening, shaking his head with a half smile. "You really did it," he said. "You turned red tape into a business model." "Guess so," I said, handing him a cup of coffee. "Still want to triple your lease rate this year?" He sighed. "Just send the invoice." We both laughed. The sun dipped below the lake, painting the water gold. The cabin lights flickered on, glowing warm against the dusk. It had started with a threat and ended with a partnership, maybe even friendship. Sometimes all it takes to fix a bad system isn't tearing it down, just reading it better than the people who wrote it. And that's how a demolition notice turned into the best deal of my life.